La próxima presentación o conferencia es de la doctora Flavia Machado sobre los cambios en las guías sobreviviendo la sepsis del año 2021, del cual ella es una activa redactora de las mismas de hace varios años. Adelante, Flavia.
To discuss with you a little bit about the new Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines on, and we're going to focus on the hemodynamics. These are my conflict of interest. I'm part of the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines. I was the chair of the hemodynamic group, and I do not have really any industry-related relevant conflict of interest. So let's speak a little bit about the initial resuscitation. These are the new guidelines. They recommend, of course, that the treatment and resuscitation starts immediately. That is something that is even more intuitive for all of us. But there is a major, this is a best practice statement, but there is a major change from the previous guidelines on 2016. On the previous guidelines, we recommended, and it was a strong recommendation, to give 30 ml per kilo of intravenous crystalloids for patients with sepsis-induced hypoperfusion. And now, reassessing the literature, the board decided to downgrade this recommendation to a weak recommendation, meaning that we suggest that we should give 30 ml per kilo, starting and giving this on the 3 first hours of resuscitation. Why we had changed this, and what does it mean? A strong or weak recommendation. A strong recommendation on the grade system means that the vast majority of the patients are probably going to benefit from this intervention. And when we use the word suggest or a weak recommendation, what we meant to say is that we need to individualize, we need to assess the situation. So this change was a consequence of the reassess of the literature. We all know that there are no randomized controlled trials about this. We only have the observational studies, the implementation studies showing that there is an association between the compliance with this bundle, this item of the bundle, and better outcomes. We also have the 3 major early goal-directed therapy studies showing that it's a best practice. It is in the control arms of these groups. The patients with hypoperfusion, they received around 60 ml per kilo before randomization and within the first 6 hours of recommendation, but these are only observational studies. As we do not have RCTs assessing this point, the board prefer to downgrade the recommendation. What we have as new evidence from this is, again, an observational study. It is mentioned on the new guidelines, but again, it's observational study. It's a study assessing the compliance with the 30 ml per kilo. And why did I put it here? Because it is interesting to notice that it was in the groups that we are more afraid of giving fluids to the patients, meaning the patients with end-stage renal disease and heart failure, that we could see the most this association between being compliant with the 30 ml per kilo and better outcomes. So I think that the main message here is that on average, all the patients should be assessed to receive 30 ml per kilo. And we are talking mostly of the patients in the emergency department and not exactly on the patients in the ICUs, chronic patients that are already with many, many days of positive fluid balance. And we also have to consider our capacity of assessing fluid responsiveness. And this is the second recommendation. There is a recommendation that was already there. There is a slight change in the wording, suggesting that we should use dynamic measurements to guide fluid resuscitation after this initial resuscitation. And this should be done instead of using static parameters or also instead of using only physical examination. However, we need to notice that the evidence that stands on the basis of this recommendation is of very low quality. So it is intuitive that we should give fluids only to patients that are fluid responsive. So what is the problem here is our capacity to really assess fluid responsiveness. We all know the limitation of these methods, and we also know the problems behind using physical examination. For instance, this is the Zambia trial, where they use physical examination. They randomized the patients to receive a fixed amount of volume, and it was a huge amount of volume because all these patients were undernourished. So they actually receive more than 70 ml per kilo, regardless the reassessment of a hypoperfusion. And they only stop giving fluids to this patient if they have clinical signs of pulmonary edema in a setting where there is no mechanical ventilation, no ICU. So this is a study that you might know and did show a higher mortality rate on this sepsis protocol as compared with the usual care, showed us that we need to be careful in places and settings where there is no organ dysfunction capacity or sustainability of the organ dysfunction, like ICUs, to use only physical examination to guide fluid resuscitation. But this is not exactly the scenario in our countries in South America. And how about fluid responsiveness, our capacity to assess it? It's controversial. There is meta-analysis, for instance, like this one, showing that assessing fluid responsiveness do not change mortality. And maybe this is just because what I said, that it's not easy to assess fluid responsiveness. And how about other forms of assessing, guiding our resuscitation? For instance, here we have a previous recommendation of using lactate levels, and there is a rewording of this because before on the last version, we said using lactate until towards normalization of the lactate, and now we said to decrease serum lactate. And this is just a correction of the wording. I think that we always meant to say that we don't need exactly to normalize lactate. We know that lactate, an elevated lactate, not always mean that the patient is hypoperfusion. There are many other causes of hyperlactatemia in these patients, including the use, for instance, of adrenaline. And there's a new recommendation about using capillary refill time. It's a suggestion, it's low quality of evidence, and this is basically based on the trial coming from South America, from Lebanon, the Andromeda shock. As you might be aware, the Andromeda trial compared the lactate resuscitation guidance with peripheral capillary refill time, and it did not show any difference in terms of the primary outcomes. When you look at this in a different way, using Bayesian analysis, you could perceive that regardless the trial you use, the performance of the capillary refill time seems to be even better than the lactate levels in terms of guiding resuscitation. However, we need to be careful. It's just a single trial. That's the reason why the board stated that it's an option for the lactate, but we believe that we still need more studies to see if these results are sustained. As I said, we need to be careful about the normalization of lactate levels. We know that lactate, the normalization of lactate sometimes took a little bit longer than the normalization of capillary refill time or the gap, CO2 gap or SVO2. So I think that the main message that the board wanted to say, what we changed from the previous guidelines, is to say that we need a broader approach on the guidance of the initial resuscitation. And how about mean arterial pressure targets? there is no change from the previous guidelines. We're still recommending that the mark targets are 65 instead of higher targets. We know that this evidence comes mostly from the sepsis PAN trial and the ovation trial that we're considering on the 2016 trials. And this year we had the publication of the 65 trial, which was also in the same direction. On this new trial, patients over 65 of age were randomized either to a group where they aim to 60 to 65 of mean arterial pressure or usual care. And as we could see, there was a difference in favor of the lower target on this group of old patients in the adjusted analysis, suggesting that we might be taking better care of our older patients if we spare catecholamines, if we spare vasopressors, aiming to a lower target. However, we need to be careful because we are not so good in accomplishing with the targets that we establish. What I meant to say is that on the first days after randomization, even the patients randomized to this 60-65 target, they were more on the target, the usual target of 65 to 70. So it seems that when we want to be on 65, 70, we need to aim to 60 to 65. And it seems that being on the regular target of 65, 70 seems to be safe, even for older patients. And how about the hemodynamic part of the surviving sepsis? As I said, I was the chair of this group, and it was a great pleasure to work with all these people. They were wonderful. We assessed, for instance, fluids. There was no new recommendation regarding the use of crystalloids as first choice for resuscitation. So it is still the same recommendation. However, there was a significant change from the previous guidelines. On the 2016 guidelines, we suggested that either balanced crystalloids or saline could be used for septic patients. And we changed this year for a suggestion with low quality of evidence to use balanced crystalloids instead of a normal saline. And why we did this? What we did, we took the subgroup of septic patients from the 3 randomized trials that we have up to date. So we know that there was a lot of observational studies suggesting the superiority of balanced solution, but we up to the last version of the Surviving Sepsis Campaign, we only had the split trial. And since then, we had 2 more randomized trials. Both of them are single center, both of them are cluster randomized trials. So we pick up only the septic group of these 3 trials, and in the meta-analysis, what we could see was a suggestion, a benefit in terms of mortality, and also a benefit in terms of benefit with a confidence interval that is over the 1, but it's okay, in terms of reducing the need for renal replacement therapy. So because of this, the board stated there is as a suggestion, however, acknowledging that we would have some new evidence. It's true, after the publication of the guidelines, the basic studies coming from Brazil, from BRICNET, was published in JAMA. And this is a different trial. It's not a cluster randomized trial. It's not a single center. It's a multi-center individual randomized trial that included 11,000 patients. And in our trial, in our setting in Brazil, we were not able to see any benefit in terms of mortality for the subgroup of septic patient, which was a predefined subgroup for our analysis. So now we will have to wait. We know that the PLUS trial is already finished. It is the ANZIX trial, and the meta-analysis of all these trials are also to be published, and we will see. We are also preparing an individual meta-analysis because these trials are different, also plus and also basics. Both are individual randomization trials, and the other trials are cluster trials, which might make a difference. So let's wait for the publication. Going on, how about colloids? There was a huge discussion about albumin on this new version of the guidelines, and we end up suggesting that we can use, or we could use, albumin on those patients who already receive large volumes of crystalloids. We consider this a moderate quality of evidence. Actually, when we look at the literature, when we meta-analyze the trials, it's something difficult to do because there are different trials, different designs. There are trials where the albumin was given as a resuscitation fluid. There are trials where the albumin was given to maintain high levels of albumin. So when you meta-analyze these, you cannot see a benefit in terms of mortality. However, you cannot see harm either. So, and there are some benefits in terms of higher filling pressures and in terms of hemodynamic effect. So the board considered that this is a safe drug to be used. And it's also true that in some parts of the world, it is not a costly therapy. So it would be a option. As I said, when you have a suggestion in the grade system, you are only saying that you can individualize therapy. We have no change for the recommendation against starts, and we have a new recommendation as a suggestion against the use of gelatin on those patients. When you analyze the literature, we have only few trials, but they suggest that there is harm when you use gelatin, which is the same when you use starch. These are, as I said, the meta-analysis for albumin, and something that I did not mention, but it's important to mention, is that in some meta-analysis, there was a difference between when you compare septic patients and when you compare septic shock patients. But in our meta-analysis done by the group of the Surviving Sepsis Campaign, we could not perceive any interaction between sepsis or septic shock patients and the effect of albumin, which also support that we did not made different recommendations for septic and septic shock patients. How about pressures? Did it change? Did we have any major change in vasopressures? I would say yes. The first change, it was just a sort of how we wrote the recommendation, because of course the recommendation per se is the same. We still recommend norepinephrine as the first line agent over other vasopressors, but at this time we decided to clearly state the level of evidence for each of the vasopressors that we are comparing with norepinephrine. So for dopamine, I think there is no change at all. It's high quality of evidence. We know that there are meta-analyses already showing the higher risk of arrhythmias when you use dopamine. But for instance, vasopressin, it's interesting. You have to look at the literature in different ways. One is the direct comparison between norepinephrine and vasopressin. And the other way to look at this, and we made a different recommendation for that, it is the combination therapy. So in the direct comparison between vasopressin and norepinephrine, we have the VANISH trial, which was a factorial trial with the use of hydrocortisone as well. But when you look at the direct comparison, what you were able to show, it was no difference in terms of the primary outcome, which was renal failure. We have no difference in terms of mortality, but yes, it seems that we have a difference in terms of the need for renal replacement therapy. But the board thought that there was no really reason to recommend vasopressin, as the literature with norepinephrine and the practices, the usual practices for everyone is to use noradrenaline as the first choice. As with the comparison with epinephrine, it is interesting. We don't have really evidence to say that norepinephrine is superior to epinephrine. We only have this very small study, including about 300 patients. And there was only physiological endpoints, no clinical relevant endpoint was studied in this trial because they were not powered enough to study this. So what we can say is that both can reach marked targets nicely, but maybe the epinephrine increase a little bit more the heart rate, increases lactate levels, and it doesn't mean that the way that this increase happened is by the increase of hypoperfusion. It's probably much more an increase in the glycolysis and also increase the need for insulin. So if you have no benefit in terms of reaching marked targets and you have this physiological effects of epinephrine, there is no reason in our assessment to use epinephrine as the first choice, at least in patients that has no problem with myocardial dysfunction. Celepressin is a new drug. Actually, it is not on the market anywhere in the world. So anyway, we thought that we need to assess the literature if the companies decided to put it on the market. So it's a sort, it's also a vasopressinergic agent. It's a V1 selective agent and was promising, actually. However, we had two studies, the phase 2 study and the phase 3 study was interrupted earlier in the course of the trial after the inclusion of 800 patients because for futility. So when you meta-analyze both studies, you cannot see any change in mortality, but you can also not see any harm in terms of mesenteric ischemia or arrhythmia. So let's see, it's not on the market. It's probably will never come on the market. And how about angiotensin II? Angiotensin II, it's a new drug. It's available only in a few countries, like US, for instance. And it was approved by FDA on the basis of only 2 very small studies. The ATOS trial actually used as a primary outcome the mean arterial pressure after 3 hours. So it is not a patient-centered outcome like the trial of celepressin. And as it reached a good mean arterial pressure after 3 hours as compared with norepinephrine, the company obtained the approval for not only for refractory septic shock, but for any septic shock. So it is available on some countries in the world. And how about combination therapy? This is interesting because we all know the harmful effects of adrenergic drugs. We all are aware that it's not only having an increased risk of arrhythmias and increased heart rate. Adrenergic drugs are known or suspected to enhance bacterial replication. It is suspected to decrease our capacity, our immune capacity. So there are many potential reasons why we should try to spare adrenergic drugs. So what we did on this version of the guidelines was trying to look at the studies that use vasopressin in addition to norepinephrine and not instead of norepinephrine. And on this way, The main study is vast, but we do have at least 9 studies. And these 9 studies, when we meta-analyze them, what you see, it's a decrease in mortality and maybe also some effect in renal replacement therapy. And we see no effect or no harmful effects in terms of digital ischemia. So this based our recommendation suggesting to use vasopressin together with norepinephrine. However, as all these studies have different designs and use vasopressin in different doses of the baseline norepinephrine, we could not ensure a recommendation on what is the doses of norepinephrine that you should start vasopressin. So in our practices, meaning on average in the committee, people start vasopressin in norepinephrine doses that are around 0.25 to 0.5. So this is why the recommendation comes on this way. There is another recommendation that is with low quality of evidence, saying that maybe in patients that are using norepinephrine and vasopressin, we can add epinephrine as a additional drug, and a recommendation against the use of terlipressin based on all these studies suggesting that although there is no increase in mortality and no increase in arrhythmias, there is an increase in other adverse events with the use of terlipressin. How about inotropes? No change from the previous recommendation that in patients with cardiac dysfunction and persistent hypoperfusion, and in which we already gave adequate volume and mean arterial pressure is reached, we can use dobutamine, or you can add dobutamine to norepinephrine, or you can use epinephrine alone. The evidence for dobutamine is not good. There is no RCT. There are only physiological trials, but when we use a network meta-analysis, we could see there is no potential harm. So this is the reason why we still keep the recommendation with low quality of evidence. And about using epinephrine alone, it seems that there is no difference between the dobutamine plus norepinephrine versus epinephrine. How about levosimendan? There is a suggestion against the use of levosimendan, either in comparison with dobutamine or with no inotropes. The meta-analysis suggests harm. The main study, which is the Leopards trial, they showed an increase in adverse events associated with levosimendan, so we suggest not to use it. I'm running out of time, so let's go to this last part. The recommendation of using arterial blood pressure has not changed, but we have a new recommendation that suggests that we need to start vasopressors in a peripheral vein to restore mean arterial pressure as soon as possible, instead of delaying this to get a central access, because we know, and we have no RCTs on this, but we have evidence that delaying the restoration of MAP is deleterious. And also we have this sub-study of the RISE trial showing that the patients who were randomized, who had used peripheral veins, which means that they were not randomized for the early goal-directed therapy, the mean time from the start of vasopressors was much shorter than those patients that needed the insertion of catheter. There are systematic reviews showing that the adverse events like necrosis are not so common with peripheral norepinephrine, so we can use it nicely. Fluid balance, actually, the board said that there is insufficient evidence to make any recommendation about the use of restrictive versus liberal fluid strategies within the first 24 hours and after initial resuscitation. Let's understand this quite well. We are talking about something that happens after initial resuscitation and within the first 24 hours. We don't know exactly what to do within these first hours. And the reason why we state this is because when you look at the literature, we only have these 5 very small RCTs, and they have different criteria of what they are calling restrictive or calling liberal. So it's very hard to look at this literature at this moment. And even when we meta-analyze them, there is no difference in terms of mortality. We will have soon the results of the Clovis trial, and maybe this can help us with a new recommendation in the future. In conclusion, yes, I think that the hemodynamic guidelines in this new Surviving Sepsis campaign has changed. They have improved a lot. It is there's a lot of work of a lot of nice people, very committed to make a new document at this time and in all times, and it's a continuous process of improvement. Something that is clear is that we need more evidence, and we have only very few moderate or high quality of evidence in hemodynamics, so we need to keep working. And it's even more important for us in low and middle income countries to have nice studies like the Andromeda to answer these questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
El auditorio, ¿no? Bueno, entonces vamos a aprovechar que Flavia está ahí conectada y que hace 1 hora y media que está escuchando. Nos estuvo escuchando a ella también. Y le queríamos hacer una pregunta más de opinión en relación a la primera conferencia, en relación a la sepsis en el paciente con COVID. Bueno, sin dudas que el COVID severo es un modelo particular de paciente con sepsis, pero no es otra cosa que sepsis. Nosotros, tal cual como lo plantean las guías sobreviviendo la sepsis, hemos tratado o hemos hecho lo que sabíamos hacer de antes y los hemos tratado de la misma forma a los pacientes con COVID. A pesar de eso, los resultados han sido similares a los que han obtenido ustedes desde el punto de vista de la supervivencia de estos pacientes, sobre todo en aquellos pacientes que fueron a ventilación mecánica. En ese sentido, lo que te quería preguntar es si tú pensás que esa altísima mortalidad que tienen los pacientes con COVID severo, que sobrepasa otros modelos de pacientes con distrés pulmonar, por ejemplo, y con disfunción multiorgánica, está vinculado al fenómeno biológico particular del COVID, o si eso es un reflejo de la calidad de atención médica vinculada tal vez a la sobrecarga de los equipos de salud durante la pandemia.
Ok, gracias. ¿Me escuto? ¿Sí?
Sí, se escucha perfecto.
Sí, sí. ¿Debo responder en portuñol o en inglés?
En portuñol está perfecto.
Portuñol.
En portuñol es bastante español.
No. Yo pienso que un poco de las dos cosas, mas penso que primariamente era um problema, o que ocorreu no passado é um problema da qualidade da saúde, da qualidade do cuidado que lo prestamos. Mas como disse durante a explanação, basicamente los perdemos porque eles complicaram com infecções nosocomiais, porque perdemos os mecanismos de prevenção, porque nos descuidamos da prevenção, porque não demos conta, porque havia muito a fazer, porque todas as pessoas estavam muito estressadas e ocupadas, a gravidade dos doentes era muito maior. Por isso que digo que são as duas coisas, porque sabemos que um dos componentes das infecções nosocomiais é, sem dúvida, a prevenção que cabe a nós, os profissionais de saúde, mas também a gravidade do paciente. E o paciente COVID era um paciente muito grave, e que, como todos sabemos, se queda nas UCIs por muito tempo. E se ele se queda nas UCIs, é muito difícil prevenir as infecções nosocomiais. Isto durante a pandemia, este ano, o ano que passamos. Mas agora, por exemplo, me vejo em la mesma situação. Penso que a mortalidade continua muito alta e o estresse em las UCIs é muito menor. Não temos mais as UTIs totalmente cheias de pacientes graves. E os pacientes COVID continuam morrendo. ¿Por quê? Por la gravidade, porque são pacientes que não são vacinados, ok? Mas muitos são pacientes que, a despeito de estarem vacinados, não responderam à vacina, são imunossuprimidos, são transplantados demais, são pacientes muito idosos, e não somos capazes de prevenir as infecções nosocomiales nesses pacientes. Portanto, eu penso que a resposta é um pouco das duas coisas, é o vírus, que causa uma doença devastadora e torna esses pacientes muito suscetíveis a infecções nosocomiales, e durante a pandemia, nós outros que não fomos capazes de lhe prevenir. Mas agora também não estamos dando muito conta de lo prevenir, porque a doença é muito grave.
De acuerdo. Otra pregunta que te quería hacer en relación a la segunda conferencia de los cambios que hubo en las guías sobreviviendo a la sepsis publicadas hace pocos meses, y es en relación al uso del segundo fármaco vasopresor, a la vasopresina concretamente. Y bueno, una cosa que nosotros ahora contamos con este fármaco y que hasta hace poco tiempo no había, y nos vemos en la incertidumbre en qué momento usarlo, porque cuál es la dosis de vasopresina a partir de la cual nosotros debemos empezar con infusión de vasopresina. Luego tú pusiste ese 0.25, 0.5 gamas de noradrenalina para empezar con la infusión de vasopresina. ¿Eso está basado en tu experiencia particular? ¿Es algo extraído del estudio VAST ya publicado en el año 2008 en relación a que mejoran los pacientes o tienen un mejor pronóstico cuando se empieza con vasopresina a dosis más bajas de norepinefrina?
Uma outra muito boa pergunta. Quando lo discutimos em lo board de la Surviving Sepsis Campaign, nós deparamos com 9 estudos que usaram a vasopressina como terapia combinada. Não é somente o estudo VAST. Temos outros estudos ilegalmente que usaram a terapia combinada. E todo o problema é que esses estudos la utilizaram em doses diferentes. O VAST usou com a dose 0.15, 0.2, e depende do peso, mas outros estudos utilizaram com 0.5. Então, quando o board olhou a evidência da literatura, não havia como nós dizemos que a evidência correria o uso em tal dose. Então, o mecanismo em lo board para esta situação, em que não é possível dar uma baseada em evidência, é o que nós outros chamamos de em nossa prática. Em nossa prática, foi um survey que se perguntou a todos os membros do board em qual dose os outros lo utilizávamos. E por isso está escrito em nossa prática, porque não é possível, com base na evidência, dizer a que dose se deve fazer. Precisamos de um outro estudo que nos diga mais claramente se deve ser feito como o VAST fez, precocemente, a dose de 0,15, 0,2, que eu particularmente é a dose que eu utilizo, ou se somente a dose mais rápidas, como o tratamento de choque refratário. Não há como dizer que uma coisa é certa e outra coisa é errada. Pode-se fazer de ambas as formas.
Perfecto, muchas gracias Flavia. No sé si tenemos tiempo para alguna otra pregunta. Bueno, tenemos que ir cerrando por acá. Gracias Flavia y bueno, esperemos que para el próximo Congreso dentro de 2 años puedas estar acá en forma presencial.
Sí, será un placer. Gracias, muy gracias por la invitación.